Hello, my name is Jolene Friedman. My married name is Thompson. I was born November the 26th in 1940 in Council Bluffs, Iowa at Mercy Hospital, I believe. And I'm going to have to ask my sister Marlene if that's correct.
That is correct.
One of us was born in Jenny and the other one at Mercy, so I believe I was at Mercy Hospital. And my parents were Maurice and Mary Friedman. My grandparents, who lived in Council Bluffs with us, were Pauline and Philip Friedman. My father's brother was Arthur Friedman. He was his twin brother, actually. And Lester Friedman was the youngest. Now, Dad originally, and Uncle Art and my grandfather, Philip and Pauline, my grandmother, lived in Glenwood, Iowa. And Marlene, I don't know if you remember what year they came to Council Bluffs.
I have to say that originally they were in Council Bluffs,
Yes.
on Main Street.
Okay.
And they had a store, I think it was a clothing store.
Yeah, they did.
And they lived above it.
Wasn't that on Main Street?
On Main Street.
Weren't they born on Main Street?
Yes.
Above, okay, above the store.
Then you can tell that story of Uncle Art and Dad and how when they were born, they were like 2.5 pounds. They wrapped them in cotton and put them on the oven door. And that was the incubator kind of in those days. And they lived. And then at that time, they got Nellie Sullivan, who was 16 years old, came from Ireland, I believe, because of a famine, and she lived with them until her death, and took care of all 3 of the boys.
That's right.
As Grandma and Grandpa were working in either the clothing store or the grocery store that they had. Now, sometime, and I believe it wasn't until like 1929 when Dad and Uncle Art graduated from Iowa University.
That's right, yeah.
The Depression hit. Grandpa lost a lot of the money, as everybody else did at that time, and that's when they took off to Glenwood, Iowa, which is just like 30 miles south of Council Bluffs, and
they had a tailor store there also.
right,
A men's
and-
clothing store, and they also had a tailor shop next door. So they
and
sold
somewhere there are pictures of them on, I think it was Friday nights. They would have outdoors, the farmers would come in, and it's showing Dad standing up there telling the people, come into the store, we have this, we have that. I don't know what was going on, really. I think it was Friday nights when...
On Shabbat?
Yeah, but the Jewish thing wasn't important at that time. The important thing was to make a living and keep your family together.
That's true. After the Depression.
And most Jews had stores.
This was after the Depression, you're saying?
Well,
so
during, sort of. They went to Glenwood, and now how long they were there, I don't know. And when they came back, I think it was when Uncle Art went into the war, World War II. And then Grandma and Grandpa moved back to
Council Bluffs.
Bluffs.
Yeah. And Dad came with them.
And bought, at that time, the Pickwick grocery store on 27th and Broadway. And their house was right next door. There was like a big parking lot in between and then the house. So Uncle Lester also went into the Army at that time. He went to England, and Uncle Art really never left the States. But because Dad was married, he and Mom, he didn't go into the service. He and Mom went out to California to work in a bomber plant during the war, and that's when, now you were just a baby.
I was,
And there
yeah.
are those pictures of you walking on the sand with your harness and mother taking you on the beach.
Yeah, and that
And-
was, and of course, I don't remember much about that. That was in,
Would have been in
probably about
1941,
1942. About
maybe.
42, I
You
think,
were
as
just
I recall.
tiny,
Yeah.
baby. Then the folks, the grandparents needed Dad to come back
Yeah.
and to help them with the store.
Well,
So they
no,
went back.
I'll tell you, when we went back to Council Bluffs, Dad, we had cousins who owned the Liberty Theater and the Strand Theater. So when we came back, my father managed both of those places for both of the movie theaters for them. And of course, we had a cousin, Al Harding, who actually owned and managed the concession store right next door. I don't know how many of you were
Store, they
right.
called it, the
Yeah.
cigar store.
And they had wonderful popcorn and candy, and of course, Dad managing the store. My mother would often bring us to the movies there. My memories were that, of course,
Every
Dad would take
weekend.
me and sit me down, and and then as you got a little older, you got to come too.
And they also had those Friday night things at the Liberty.
I don't
That
remember
we usually didn't get to stay for because it was later, probably 8 o'clock. And it was something too then about, I don't know, I think they had drawings.
Oh yeah, they did. They had some sort of
Yeah,
you
and so
probably won a free movie
tell
ticket.
them the names of the cousins. Apparently they were cousins, but we called him Uncle.
It was Maury Cohen and Abe Sneed.
Who were
And
brothers.
They were actually brothers, and we don't really know why they must have had a different mother or father or something, but they were brothers, and they didn't get along real well.
Oh, one, I think Abe gave up the Cohen name because he didn't, want people to know he was Jewish. I think
could have
that
been,
was
I
the
don't know.
thing.
But Sneed sounds sort of Jewish to me anyway, so I never did understand
But
it.
somebody told me last night at the Oneg, or Friday night at the Oneg at the synagogue, that they remembered Abe. And they said, but he didn't want to be Jewish.
Yeah, that's very possible.
So,
Very possible.
the Liberty Theater was the older. The Strand Theater, which was right across the street, these were on Broadway, was a gorgeous building. And why they tore it down in our lifetime, we don't know. But there are pictures at the synagogue in Council Bluffs of the Strand Theater. It was
Yeah.
gorgeous, mosaic building, the outside, the exterior. It's just a shame it was torn
Last night I
down.
was reading some of the histories of people who wrote in, who had grown up in Council Bluffs, and in, I would say, maybe 8 out of 10, it would say, what are your fondest memories of Council Bluffs? And they would say, going to the Strand Theater on the weekends. And they were fond memories for us too.
Yeah. But so what was nice was that we could just walk in anytime. And they usually recognized us, and we would just walk in. We
Not
never,
usually, always.
Yeah, we never had to pay.
Yeah, that's
And
right.
our friends
That's
thought
right.
that was really neat. Now, I can remember Pam going with us.
A friend
and
of yours.
Pam
Yeah.
Freeze. And our parents were just like this, very, very close, all our lives. And she would go with me, and I was trying to think this morning, did she have to pay? I don't know. She probably would
Yeah,
remember.
yeah. At some point, do you remember when it was? I know it was when Uncle Art and Uncle Lester came back from the war, that Dad and Uncle Art decided to go into business together. And they decided they would run a furniture and appliance store. There were already a Master Appliance, and I believe that was Sobalski's, if I'm not mistaken.
Finkel.
No, I think
Oh,
Master.
at that time, I don't
Master.
know.
But
Yeah,
anyway, they
yeah.
decided to go to Omaha instead of Council Bluffs because there were enough furniture stores, I believe, in Council Bluffs. So they moved over to Omaha, and their very first store I believe was the one we just found. Wasn't that on
16th and
16th?
Capitol.
And, no,
Capitol.
Capitol or Locust? No,
Six-
Locust was the last one.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was 16th and Capitol. And then, and it was Home Outfitting and Allied Appliance. Those were the two names that I recall. At one point it was Allied Appliance and the other, oh no, Allied Appliance was the very first store.
Mhm.
Second store, I don't remember where that was. That was the one across from no, there was an original store, and then they ended up across from where now, across the street from the post office in Omaha now, was their second store. And that was a nice, large
See, I
store.
don't remember the first store at all.
Yeah, and at that point, they were also a silent partner they took in was Doc Fellman from Omaha, Nebraska. And I remember that.
He's
And that
a
was
dentist,
the
and
second store.
He has a son that is
Tommy Fellman.
married.
Yeah, and they weren't relatives, but they were friends, and Doc was looking for an investment, and I think Dad and Uncle Art wanted to expand the store at that point. So, I do remember
See,
that.
that's the only store that I remember.
Yeah.
That I remember.
I
And
didn't
it
talk
was
about,
underneath the Loyal Hotel.
yeah, that's true. There
You
was a
never
one before that.
introduced me. I'm Marlene, her sister.
Yeah, that's very good.
And I'm the younger sister.
That's true.
The
Tell
bigger
him-
sister.
Tell him
with
what
the-
year you were born.
1943, July 2nd. So 2.5 years younger,
Yeah.
but she has always, they've always carded her when we were younger, and they never carded me, but I carried her ID.
That's because I didn't grow up very tall. And you know, I was trying to think too, growing up in Council Bluffs, you know, it felt so safe, so warm. People were always very, very friendly. And I was remembering the religious school that we had, and Rabbi David Korb was the rabbi that I remember the most.
Yeah.
And our religious school still exists. We found the old house. Marlene and I were driving around last night. I believe it's on 7th Street or 7th Avenue. Is that right?
South of Broadway,
Mhm.
a huge white home, which I thought they had told me was now the historical building in Council Bluffs, but apparently
like
it
that.
isn't. I think most of the information is at the synagogue now in
Yeah,
Council Bluffs. But in this now looked like apartments. We could see it was dark, and we could see people in this home. But there are several pictures of Sunday school classes outside on the large porch.
Yeah, family members, I was trying to remember, and we definitely belonged to the synagogue in Council Bluffs, and I don't recall ever going to Omaha
For
for
services.
services. We
Mhm.
went on Friday nights, and I even remember a lot of the times Dad was working. And I do remember that Dad would say to Mom, you take the kids and you go to services. And, you know, I can remember at one point asking, well, Dad, why aren't you going? Well, it's important that you go. I have to work. And I do remember that a lot.
And we had, it was an Orthodox synagogue where we grew up, the only synagogue in Council Bluffs. And we had to sit separately from the men.
Yeah, but you were very young. You couldn't possibly remember that, could
Oh,
you?
of course
Do you
I
really?
do. I do, and I remember we had to wear hats. We had to cover our heads. The women had to cover their heads. That was as important as the yarmulkes for the
Yeah,
men.
yeah.
And I don't know when that stopped, really. We thought it was only Orthodox, and
No, it became, they brought in one of the rabbis, and he was leaning more toward conservative Judaism. And at that point, I remember there were battles going on, but I was still quite young, so you would have been younger than me.
the bima in the synagogue was in the middle.
Yeah.
And it's different than it is now. They've changed it, and I think that the balcony where they said that the women had to sit up in the balcony, and see, I remember it more where we sat on one side. It was like the bima in the middle and the women on one side and the men on the other.
I remember sitting in the balcony.
And
But that might have been because I was older, and so maybe for a
Yeah.
couple of years we did that.
I don't know, but I do remember going up in the balcony too,
Yeah.
but I remember sitting on the side, and there wasn't a whole lot that that I knew what was going on, because of course we didn't speak Hebrew. I mean, they didn't have bas mitzvahs in those days. We were both confirmed at around 13 years of age. So we had confirmations, but we did not have bas mitzvahs, so we did not learn to speak Hebrew. And so to follow a prayer book, you didn't. And then the women, and they would tell us at that age, well, it's not really important that you learn to speak Hebrew.
But I
anyway.
remember a good story about that, and one of the things that it's very vividly implanted in my mind because it was traumatic for me. I decided, being a rather independent young woman, at 11 or 12, whatever age I was, that I was going to learn Hebrew, and I was going to have a bat mitzvah because I knew in Omaha, Nebraska, they would do it. So one of the rabbis, whoever we had at that point, and it might have been Korb, I don't recall, said, okay, you can go to Hebrew school. But they were all men. They were all men. They were all young boys. And I remember going to at least 3 classes. And I remember coming home each time crying because the boys didn't want me there. I was the only girl. And I remember coming home, and finally about the 3rd time I did that, my father said, it's okay, honey. Girls don't really need to learn to speak Hebrew.
It's not important.
It's not important. And I remember being really traumatized by that. Not so much Dad told me it wasn't important, but I think more the fact that the boys didn't want me there. Probably made fun of me at that point, which would have been normal for kids of 11, 12 years old. But I recall thinking, well, I'll show them. That was initially probably the first time I went. And then later I kept thinking, I'm going to learn this someday and get my bat mitzvah, which of course I didn't do. So.
Well, on Sundays, we had Sunday school, and Dad made sure we were there.
Oh, yeah.
And he was the one who usually took us.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
And then we always had assemblies. I mean, I can remember having class time. And then we'd have the big assembly where all of us were, in the assembly. And so the ages varied from 5 to through high school. And so we learned a lot of music. We had a lot of music, and he would talk to us about the holidays, each time a Jewish holiday. Well, I tell him about the time that we went under the sea, Jolene and I, our grandparents were not that religious, and from Germany. Well, Grandpa was from Lithuania, Grandma was from Austria. It was more important to come to America, to be an American, to have freedom, to get away from the pogroms and the Tsar of Russia, which is what his naturalization papers say. So it was important to fit in and to have a life here. So the religious thing, now we can remember Grandma Friedman always faithfully lit the candles and faithfully covered her head with a tallit and was,
Well, she kept a
We
kosher
have her-
home. She kept a kosher home for
Yeah.
many, many years. I can remember soaking those chickens to get all the blood out before she could cook. Oh,
and give us chicken feet to eat, and we ate them.
No, I didn't eat them.
No,
Oh,
I
never
did.
ate
I
'em.
remember sucking on the chicken feet. Anyway, where was? Oh, I wanted to tell about the fact that Grandma. See, when the store was in Omaha, so usually on Thursday nights we would go over and have. Grandma would
You
take
mean
us.
Dad's store,
Yeah.
not Grandma's store. Grandma's store was
Yeah, no,
Pickwick.
Dad's. The
Yeah.
furniture store in Omaha on 16th. We would walk up the street to Brandeis, which was the big department store in Omaha, and there we would have a buffet. You'd go through the line and have dinner. And she always wanted, at Christmas time, she wanted the take the girls upstairs, she would say to Mother, on Santa Claus' lap. So, you know, we have one picture where we actually did that. And it was Grandma that insisted that she do that. Anyway, the other time then, I don't know how old we were, but we wanted to have a Hanukkah bush. So
Oh, I remember that.
we insisted that we get this aluminum silver bush, and we were going to put lights on it, blue lights. So we did that, and we sat it in the corner of the living room. Well, the next Sunday at Sunday school, in the assembly, the rabbi said, "I'm not going to mention names."
Yeah, that's right.
But I went by one of your homes, and I saw there, I know they call it a Hanukkah bush, but there is no such thing as a Hanukkah bush. So you couldn't get away with anything in Council Bluffs.
And I
I
do
mean,
remember that.
they would see it. And so, you know, there were probably other families, but they were smarter. They didn't put it in the window.
I do remember
So
that.
that you know, we felt our Judaism, we felt our separateness, and I wanted to say too, then we went to teach Thomas Jefferson High School. There were 2 high schools. Most of the Jewish kids were in the East End,
Yeah.
and they went there. There were maybe 6 there and 2 at Thomas Jefferson. You know,
Well, no, there were
I mean,
a few more than
it
that. We
was
had Arliss Goodman, we had the
depending on the
Goodman
time.
kids were down there with us, and the Davidson boys, I believe, went to Thomas Jefferson.
Right, and in my article in the book, I say the Arnolds instead of the Davidsons, because Arnold was more my age, and I, you know, after
Yeah.
45 years,
And I believe that
forget.
the Davidsons lived right next to us, and one reason we located in the west part of the city was because Dad's business was in Omaha, Nebraska.
Right,
So
and
it was
just
much
over the
closer to
bridge.
jump over that bridge and for him to get to the store on time. And, you know, I was thinking about a lot of the family members. We had family members in Omaha. We didn't know a lot of we didn't get together with a lot of family members much. A lot of that had to do with Dad's long, long hours. And I think he was probably very traumatized by his father, who had been very wealthy with the clothing business before the crash. They had lived very, very well for many, many years. Then it was a struggle. So I remember Dad working every night. I remember his long hours of the furniture store in Omaha. And he would come home sometimes very late, oftentimes after school when we were young, before we got involved in activities. Mother would take us to the store, and we would all go out somewhere to have dinner, and then we'd go back to the store, sit there while Dad would sell furniture, and then she would bring us home to put us to bed before he even came home.
and you
So-
remember the joke? We would be sitting there, and we would be waiting for him to get done with his customer, and then
to come and
the-
talk to us, because we
the
just
joke
worshiped
was that we would hear him sometimes, and he would, for our benefit, he would say, "No, the furniture is direct from the factory."
I do remember that. And we would go,
And we,
"Oh my
yeah,
gosh."
we have to run away and laugh because direct meaning junk from the factory. But they thought he said direct from the factory.
He wouldn't do that very often, but he did do it once in
Yeah.
a while, just for our sake.
I do
Yeah, and
remember
it was fun.
Yeah.
That was fun. I was thinking too about, you know, some of the friends that we had. I grew up, of course, with, again, there weren't very many, we weren't that close as we were real young to the other Jewish kids because they were at the other end of town. But as we got a little older, both Marlene and I got very involved in Omaha, Nebraska, which was where the youth groups were. And we would have to rely on either our parents to take us over there
B'nai B'rith
for the
girls.
meeting, the BBGs, and there were a couple of other groups too. And we got involved with those. So it was at the Jewish Community Center in Omaha where all of our Jewish activities basically were, because
In
our-
high school.
as far as my age, there was only one other boy my age, and that was Ronnie Gordon. And then there were Arliss Goodman, Elaine Selo, Phyllis Binstein, Myra Cohen, and Linda Passer. And so, you know, you think about that, those numbers, just a handful of people the same age. So all the social was in Omaha at the Jewish Community Center. Everything was over there. And I can remember the folks, and even my grandparents,
Swim
when they were
lessons,
alive.
we did do that as a
Right.
younger
Oh, yeah.
age. We went to the JCC.
And we
first.
had relatives in Omaha, but we rarely saw them. I just don't remember as kids. As we got older and there began to be anniversaries, when we got married, engagement parties, then the Wallners in Omaha were relatives. Shirley Wallner later in life married Sam Meyerson in Council Bluffs. That was the second husband. The first husband, Wallner, I remember him and his kids. They died. He died early.
We had
Some Friedmans were relatives.
well,
also.
the cousins lived in some small town that we would visit.
Just
Jacob.
don't remember.
Well, we never backed up to say that Philip Friedman had, we
Right,
think, five brothers. And the oldest being Sam, and he came over first, and then he sent for each one at a time, and then the grandparents, and brought them all over here. Now, the Sam was the oldest, and for some reason I remember Dad saying he had a junkyard in Fort Dodge, and that's where he started. But
Don't remember.
later, so we don't know who those cousins were. His children, we never had contact. We had
But
some
we did have contact when we were very young,
with
but
Jacob.
we don't remember.
Jake's Friedman's children were
Jacob,
yes, you do know. She lives in Houston. The one daughter, Marcia, Friedman, and
No,
the-
that was Ed Friedman. He
right,
was a
and
cousin.
his father was Jacob.
Yeah, that's right. And Ed Friedman lived, and
And
they
what
lived
were the
in
three
Council
girls'
Bluffs.
names?
Marcia and Linda and Barbara.
Barbara,
Friedman.
okay.
Yeah.
And so we did, over the
Yeah.
years, kind of keep in
Yeah, we
contact.
kept in
Now
touch
the
with
youngest
them.
is in Houston, where you are
But there was
now.
Samuel, and there was Donnie, and Jacob, and who was the others? That's
Well,
where
Jacob-
we're lost.
Jacob Shirley was the daughter of we don't know which one.
Yeah.
And if I can find that tape of Dad's,
We have
that would tell us a little bit more.
I think what happened was the relatives who ended up in Fort Dodge probably did not gravitate to Council
Oh.
Bluffs. I think
But
that's
Ann
what
Landers and
Oh, that's right. Ann Landers,
her sister, Abigail, or whatever.
were Freedmans, and they
well,
were
they
cousins.
were names were switched around. One was
That's right.
something Esther and Esther something.
That's right.
And they were Freedmans from Sioux City. Didn't Dad remembered as a child
Yeah, knowing
being
them.
with them, because see, they were twins, and Dad and Uncle Art were twins, the Friedman twin girls and the Friedman twin boys.
Right.
And they had contacted at a younger age. Once in Des Moines, we had Ann Landers, and I tried to say, I'm your cousin, so what? She didn't care. So,
But we don't know which of Grandpa's
No.
brothers they were the children of.
no,
right?
but I think on the tape,
Yeah, that we
no.
may have more information about.
Do you have any idea at all of how the family came to Iowa?
Well, that's what
The original,
Fort Dodge was the first place they ended up.
I'm sure from other family members. Oh, no, that
Well,
would
they-
have been Grandma Friedman.
We know
The
that
Hardings.
We know that our grandfather, Philip, ended up in New York and the ship, and we have his naturalization paper, which is wonderful, and it says it discloses where he renounces the Tsar of Russia, but he actually came from Lithuania. Is actually where he lived.
But see, at that time, Lithuania was
Yeah,
under Russian
I know.
control, the borders.
But that's where apparently when he settled in New York, he must have worked there for a time before he came
I
to
don't
Iowa.
think so. He was only 14.
Well, he met Grandma there. That's where he met Grandma.
Oh.
She was a Harding, and she was at that point living in New York. So my understanding was they met. He couldn't have, I don't know how long he was there, but she must have come with him to Council Bluffs. But I don't know how they
Well,
got
but
there.
Aunt Ricky and
Ricky
Uncle
Harding.
Sam Harding.
Sam Harding
Now
and
that-
Ben Harding. There was Ben Harding.
And
who
so
lived
then
in Council.
Al Harding was the son of Ben.
Ben Harding lived in Council Bluffs. He was definitely a cousin. And Sam Harding.
It had to have been through relatives. It had to have been that
Somebody
somebody
brought
else
this.
was here.
Right.
And the contact that Sam had to go to Fort Dodge,
I
who
know
knows who
why.
that was.
Yeah,
But
that's lost.
Let me hear a little bit about growing up and going to high school.
Well, that was a difficult situation. I can tell you that for me anyway, you know, maybe by the time Marlene, a little bit older, they knew a little bit more about Judaism, but I felt really very, very different from the other kids. And Avenue B School was where we went to grade school. We then went to
always
Edison.
different.
Yeah, we went to
Oh.
Edison, and I remember in Avenue B though, my father said, I became friends. They called us the Four Musketeers. Eventually, by junior high, I met 4 girlfriends. Again, not Jewish, and Dad encouraged me to go with them to their churches, so I would know about other religions. But he always said, "Be very careful you don't forget your own." And of course, at that point, I was pretty well grounded in my Judaism. And it's interesting. You wonder how. Because Dad didn't go to services with us very often, but we went to religious school. So, I mean, in my heart, I was very Jewish, but he really encouraged me. I had a girlfriend who was Methodist, a girlfriend who was Presbyterian, and a girlfriend who was Catholic. And I don't remember the other one, but, and nevertheless, I went to their religious services with him because he did encourage us.
See, I never did that. I
But-
think I went with him.
But in
once.
grade school, I remember, you know, it was fun in grade school. We were young, it was
Oh.
fun, but I do remember some prejudice. Not till later, and I would say maybe 5th, 6th grade, I really thought one of my teachers was very prejudiced, because I can recall her saying something about, I heard her as I was going out to the playground, something, and she was talking to another teacher, and I heard her say something about she's Jewish. And I will never forget that. And she had then or later kicked me out of class because I used to twirl, I would get nervous in class and I would twirl my hair. And I can remember her sending me to the principal. And then I remember her saying something about she's Jewish. It had to be me because there wasn't anybody else in class. So I remember thinking about having some fear of prejudice, but again, vaguely at that point, not knowing what it was. Now, by the time I got to high school, at TJ High School, again, I was the only Jew my age. Arliss Goodman, I believe, was a little bit younger. She may have been,
She's in between us.
yeah, but we were confirmed together, but we were not in the same class, because I graduated in 1959. So in 54, I went to Thomas Jefferson High School. I remember even saying to Dad, why can't we go to AL, where all the Jewish kids go? And Dad said, because we don't live up there. And we just can't go there. We had to go to, My
had
dad
graduated
graduated.
from
Yeah.
AL. And
That's right.
Bloomer was their grade school.
Bloomer, and they graduated at
So-
age 17, both he and my Uncle Arthur, and went on to college. They were in college at 17 years old at University of Iowa in Iowa City. And, which is ultimately where I
And
went to
there
school.
was a Jewish fraternity there.
Yeah, and he was
And
in a
this-
fraternity. He was a track, he was big in
Joyce
track at
Friedman
AL.
was his good friend
Yeah.
from California. I remember they visited and they had a daughter my age.
Yeah. Who were
That
our
was
cousins
fun.
that lived in Central City, Iowa?
Well, that must have been the Friedmans, Marcia. And
No. Started with an S.
was it
Slova.
Savolsky?
No,
Savolsky.
I don't remember.
Marlene, how was your growing up and going to school? What are your recollections?
I remember always feeling differently, and it was like here we had to assimilate in Council Bluffs, but we could go to Omaha, and that was another life.
Social, yeah.
So, and we would say we'd want a date, and Dad would,
Discouraged.
you know, what could he say? Our mother was a convert, whom, of course, Grandpa Friedman just opened arms and brought in, and Mother was probably, as far as a religious Jew, she was the religious person in our family, taking us, like Jolene said, always to services and everything. So, it was kind of like having two lives,
Yeah.
living two lives. And what she said, you know, the few friends, we didn't really have any real close Jewish friends, girls or boys.
Well, Linda Passer, I felt very close to Linda and fairly close to Arliss, but again, she was a little younger.
Right.
And in Omaha,
Well,
most of our close Jewish friends
and
we
in-
developed were
And
in
in
Omaha.
college then, I had Sheila Ellsberg, you know, somehow or another, the Jewish girls, Jolene or I pledged the Jewish sorority, but somehow we got a pie in the fraternities, and at that point we had promised ourselves, I don't know if Dad or what, but ourselves for sure, that we would not date non-Jewish boys. We would only date Jewish boys, and which we did at Iowa.
Yeah.
Two lives, I think, you know, and which one we were most comfortable in, I can't say, because
It was
we were comfortable in both lives, but in two different places. On Sunday afternoons, we almost always picked up Grandma Friedman and
from the grocery store and went to Omaha.
Grandpa. Nellie never went with us on
No.
Sunday rides. We would go to the Jewish delis down by Creighton University, I guess. Is that 16th? That's 16th. And there were several bakeries.
No, I don't remember several. I think there was
There
one
were
or two.
three. There were three.
remember some.
Because one had the challah,
Yeah.
and the other one never had the bakery stuff. You know, we had to taste a little bit on Sunday afternoons. I love that halva,
Halva candy.
yeah, and
Yeah.
you didn't. And then with the smoked salmon, don't you remember
Yeah,
eating
I
that
do
in the
remember
car?
that.
And then the rye bread, the wonderful rye breads.
Yeah.
So that, you know, those Jewish memories.
And we dated Jewish guys in Omaha, and I remember both of us were really active in the Jewish groups. We were both sweetheart candidates for both the Jewish there was
AZA.
and AZA 100, AZA 1 and AZA 100, and I was a Jewish sweetheart candidate for both of those. And I remembered loving the Jewish dating scene, but it was hard in those days because remember a lot of the kids, the
Went
boys,
to school together.
well, but a
They
lot
went
of
to
the
high school
they went to
together and we
Central
didn't.
High, but yet the Friedman girls were fairly well known and pretty popular in the Jewish community in Omaha. But it was difficult because some of those guys didn't have cars. They had to borrow their parents' cars. And I remember a couple of the guys I dated, I couldn't even tell you who they were now, but a couple of the guys had to go with other guys because the other guys owned the cars. So we always double dated whenever we went for the
And I
parties.
suspect that their parents weren't nuts about them coming to Council Bluffs
Yeah.
either to get us, you know. So I'm sure it worked
Yeah.
both ways.
And then I remember after the sweetheart parties, there were all-night deals because they would end up at somebody's house. Of course, we were supposed to be chaperoned, and we had breakfast. And I can remember I had to stop and go call my parents to be sure that they knew where I was and that I was awake and I was at somebody's house. Of course, that would have been probably junior in high school or something. But it was an all-night deal in
Yeah,
those
why
days.
was
Probably
it?
still is.
I
Probably
don't
still
know,
is.
that was odd.
I think kids
Yeah,
still do
so
that.
we had a wonderful life
Yeah.
in Omaha with our friends and in Council Bluffs.
Yeah,
But
yeah. And I can remember I had two boyfriends in Council Bluffs that were not Jewish, and my parents did not like either one of them. And Dad had said, but he didn't say it was because they weren't Jewish. He just didn't like them. He had something wrong with both of them. And I had 2 boyfriends in Omaha. Other than the ones I dated, because I didn't really, it was hard to have a steady in those days. But I had 2 that I really liked in Omaha. And Dad always encouraged me, that those were the ones, well, they're very fine people. I know their parents. They have a business, they have this. Well, it was because they were Jewish, obviously, although he didn't say that.
He
So,
didn't.
He was
And
pretty
he was
smart
very,
about those
very
things.
careful. I mean, I grew up, you never said a prejudice thing
Yeah,
about
never.
anybody.
Yeah.
I mean, not race, not religion, color, whatever. I mean,
Yeah. He did.
there was no discriminating.
I think part
Because
of that,
he would come down on us
Yeah.
hard, and all Dad had to do was speak.
but I think part of that
Never
was because of
hurt us.
Nellie, the Catholic woman that took care of the kids, who ended up, my grandmother, Nellie got very, very ill. My grandmother actually cared for her until the day she died. And probably 10 years of her life living with my grandmother, she was ill and had to be cared for. And we buried her, and she's
Speaking of that, I can remember being in Nellie's arms and her
Yeah.
rocking me and singing Tura Lora Lora.
Yeah, yeah.
I very, very vividly have that memory. And she had white hair like yours. White, but straight, cut
Yeah.
this way.
Yeah,
And that's her whole life.
yeah.
I don't ever remember her going out of the house.
I also remember, though, that Grandma had 2 or 3 people she employed, and I can recall, and maybe this was during, well, it would have been after Depression when they had the Pickwick grocery store. They were not Jewish, and she treated them like, I remember one of the fellows sweeping the store, and she treated them so well. And so a lot of this,
Oh, there
their
was the
strictness.
butcher. Remember
Yeah,
the butcher?
The Irish Catholic butcher.
What was his name?
I don't know.
Not Henry.
Isn't that funny? So I think a lot of the fact that we were raised to respect all races and all religions, I think it came from that,
And then tell them too how you said you remembered being up on the counter and helping with the
Oh,
cash
yeah.
register yesterday. I sort of remember the cash register, great big cash register
Mhm.
there, and I remember the spindle with the books that everybody would, they'd write down 1 can of soup, and they'd keep their list, and then that in this receipt book, and then they would come in and pay once a week or once a month or something. That's how they did it in these little grocery stores.
Yeah.
What today we'd call the mom and pop grocery stores, which they were, but
Oh, it was the
so
Pickwick
many
was-
Jewish families had, that was just.
My grandfather Philip, the grocery store had a potbelly stove toward the
Yeah.
back of the store, and I remember the big butcher block, and behind him there was I guess it would have been a cold meat
Freezer. You walked into it.
You would
And
open
the
it up,
meat's hanging down.
and it was all woodened around the outside, and the glass that you could look through. And I remember opening that latch, and we had to be very careful, because if Grandpa would see me go into there, he would come over running and say, no, 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 not without me. Because I guess it was a walk-in.
It would lock.
Lock from the inside, probably. So, but I do remember the cookies that they had in the cases up towards
Square.
the front of the store. And when little kids would come in, and my grandmother, I don't remember Grandpa doing this, because he was more in the back of the store usually, but Grandma would say to the little kids, go pick out 1 cookie, and you would open a glass. It was plastic on the top, but it looked like glass.
It was glass, I think,
Was it
not
glass?
plastic.
And you could see what kind of cookies were in each one, and there were like 1, 2, 3 at the bottom, 1, 2, 3 at the top, and then on the other side. And the little kids, and she would say, take 1 and go get out of here. So she never charged them for it. And that was a lot. I mean, I remember sitting there watching her just do that. And then, of course, she would say, you can have 1 too, honey. And then I'd go over and get 1 too.
Yeah, it was fun.
So,
Cookie
now-
jars were fun.
We didn't talk about our own kids. And when we got married, you want us to?
I'd like to mention about the Friedman name, in case some of you ever want to try to trace back the family. Grandpa Friedman, I guess he didn't tell me, but through the grapevine, through Dad, we know that his father's name was Floyd Fritzl, and it was Fritzel. And in the cemetery in Council Bluffs, there is a Fritzl, a Saul Fritzl, I think. And so we don't know if that was a relative or not, but it's right up in the very front of the cemetery. But we're told that when Grandpa came over, so it must have been Saul, the older son, or Sam, the oldest son. Anyway, one of them, when they came over, they asked them, "What is your name?" And they said Fritzl, and they said, "We're going to Americanize that, and it's now Friedman." So they were given that name on Ellis Island, apparently.
That's what we were told, but we don't.
Yeah. So we don't know. The only other Fritzl that we do know was in Colorado, in Denver, and he had a restaurant nightclub that we did go visit a couple of times, and his name was it
Can't
Harold?
remember. I think maybe it was Harold.
Or no, I think it was Lester. I think it was Lester.
That's right, because there were
also.
two Lesters.
Lester Fritzl instead of Lester Friedman.
Maybe his father was
A
Harold.
lovely nightclub in Denver.
That's the
Don't-
only other Fritzl we ever knew.
Yeah.
That was a relative.
Yeah, and they somehow kept their names. So which children they were of which
Yeah.
son, we don't know. But, so that's how the name came to be Friedman. There's, a lot of Jews that are Friedmans, and most of us are not related.
Well, unfortunately, with the five
That we know
brothers,
of.
with the five brothers, the majority of them took the name Friedman,
Mhm.
and they all had children. However, where they all are,
I think there's a Stephen Friedman in Omaha. At least there was when we were younger. A
was a
Stephen
relative.
Friedman,
Yeah.
it seems to me. But we never kept in contact, and I don't know why. Other than just
Everybody
being
was
busy
busy
and
working.
going their own ways.
So-
It's too bad, but we are today now. When we finish here, we're going to go visit with Sarah Harding, hopefully, and her children, Sarah and Al's, Nancy Epstein, and
they were Hardings.
Frankie,
Kaysen. Frankie Kaysen is her married name.
and they're here in town. Frankie was younger than myself. Nancy's, I think, in between us. But we have still kept in contact with her, and she's
And they're
the
first,
only
they're cousins.
They're the
Yeah.
only cousins, and she married Gary Epstein.
Well, actually, we have cousins in Dallas, the Friedmans.
Oh,
And that's
yeah.
what we were just talking about earlier, Barbara, Marcia, and Linda is in Houston, actually. Linda is the youngest of those three girls, so those are cousins.
Marcia's passed away, and Barbara's. She was in Sioux City.
Barbara still lives in Dallas, Texas. Marcia died, but
Oh.
Linda and Barbara still
Okay.
live.
I would like to talk now about my own family. I married Lester in 1964, I think. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary, so it's 2004, yeah. So May 31st, 2004, and he was with the Department of Agriculture at the time. We traveled, and by the way, we were married at the temple here in Omaha. Rabbi Brooks was the rabbi. It was great. We saw him 20 years later, and he said, "I can't believe you guys are still married." He was quite a jokester. So anyway, we traveled for about 3 years, and then we decided we wanted to have a family. We wanted 2 kids. So we looked around. He wanted to stay with the government. So he found out about a job in Des Moines, Iowa with the Internal Revenue Service. And that's what took us to Des Moines, because he did get that job, and we settled down and bought a home that we are still in. the same home, and so for another year we didn't seem to be able to get pregnant there, and then we did, and we have our 3 wonderful sons. Danny is the oldest, and he was born in 1968, and then Joel, David, who is Lester's father, died the year I was pregnant with Joel, and so he is named Joel, middle initial L, after Lester's dad, and he was born in 1970, and then Rick came along, who was named after Aunt Ricky Harding, and he was born in 1973. The 2 older boys are married now, and Danny is married to a wonderful girl, Jan, who is from Silver Spring, Maryland, and Danny was living in California and went on a trip to Israel, and they stopped in New York City, picked up this other group from the East Coast, and went on over to Israel, and that's where he met Jan. And now they have only 2 grandchildren at this time, and Roxy, who will be 3, July, and David, who is like 10 months, 11 months. He also will be 1 in July. And of course, we love them dearly, as I know we'll love all the grandchildren, but they're our first. And then Joel married Cindy in 2001, and he was doing his, I guess you would call it, intern residency in medical school in Topeka, Kansas, and met Cindy, who is from Topeka, and they are now in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And Ricky is still in Des Moines with us at this time, and not married. So we have to stay around to see our future and see what's going on there. So it's a good life. And now, do you want to talk about your immediate family?
Yeah, I'll be happy to talk about my family. I married my husband. I met him in Omaha, Nebraska, and through a girlfriend of mine, Alan Thompson, and we were married in 1963, November the 9th, 1963, and had a 4-day honeymoon we drove all the way to New Orleans. When I think about that, how far that was to drive to New Orleans just so we could have a little honeymoon. I was working then for the welfare department in Omaha, and he was an engineer with Northern Natural Gas. And we lived in Omaha for quite a few years. And in Omaha, both of our children were born. Leslie, Aline, and Philip, Allen. And we had quite a to-do about both of the kids because, of course, in Judaism, you know, we were really raised that you don't name after the living. And so we wanted to honor, and so what we did with Leslie, our firstborn, was her middle name is Aline, which is a combination of Alan and Jolene. So we were able to sort of sneak around that, and my father was fine with that, my mother was fine with that. So we were very happy with being able to name her that. And then with Philip, we thought of everything that would go with Philip, and of course Philip is named after grandfather Philip. And the Allen part of it, my husband, even though his name was Allen, his first name was not Allen, his first name was actually Fay, Alan, but he went by Alan. But his family name was Alan. So we thought we're really honoring his family name by giving the name Alan as a middle name. So we did name Philip's middle name was Alan. And and then in 1974, Alan got a wonderful opportunity to go to Houston, Texas, to help start the Northern Natural Gas Company in Houston. And he was one of 3 people that went to Houston, located there, and they started what then became Enron, of course, which all of us now are familiar with, unfortunately, Enron. And Alan actually left Enron many, many years ago, prior to the scandal and prior to what's going on now. But he remained with them for many years. The children, they excelled in swimming and all sorts of sports. Both of the kids now are in Houston with me. I'm very blessed that they're both there. Leslie is not married. She works for a wholesale electrical company, and she's been with that kind of business for many years now. Leslie went to college and graduated in Texas from college. Philip also graduated from the University of Texas in Austin, Texas. And Philip is married to a wonderful woman, Lisa, and they have one child, Jacob Allen, who is named after my husband, who is now deceased. Alan has been deceased since he died in December the 19th, 1993. And Jacob was named in his honor, even though Jacob, his name is Jacob, and we had cousins, of course. Grandpa Philip's brother was Jacob. But the kids just loved the name Jacob. But the middle name Allen was named in honor of Philip's father, Alan. And Leslie has no children. So I have such a blessing of having a wonderful grandson, Jacob, who is now about 21 months old, and I spend every moment I can with him, and he is the delight of my life, as well as my own children, of course. I love them dearly and love being with them all the time whenever that's possible. Even though we live in the same city, I still don't get to
You're
see
very
them too
lucky.
often. I know, I'm very lucky. So anyway, I'm looking forward and hoping maybe I'll have other grandchildren in the future.